Good morning to you all and welcome to the West Ham Voice. Thank you for joining me during this international break. Um, when there is an international break, it gives me an opportunity to start thinking about other stories that I can bring to you, instead of the usual, rigmarole of hearing about David Moyes about to be sacked and this happening and that happening and so on and so forth. And one of the stories that I like to bring to you is something that I kind of touched upon briefly in the West Ham Weekly Show on Monday night. And that, of course, is about a story that came out last week when apparently Tim Steidten and Mark Noble had met with the parents of academy players to promise them that these future potential stars would soon be getting more opportunities and more game time in the senior team. Now, I briefly covered it, as I said, on the weekly show, and I kind of questioned it, to be quite honest with you. You know, did this meeting really happen? Were these promises really given? Because, to be quite honest, Tim Steidten and Mark Noble, as much as they want to sort of oversee the development of the academy and sort of making sure that the academy players are progressing and hopefully be ready for senior call-ups, they can't make a promise like this to say your players will soon get game time. At this moment in time, as we know, that is David Moyes' decision to make. And whether, if he thinks, whether rightly or wrongly, if he thinks that any player is worthy of progressing to the senior squad, then he'll make that decision and not Tim Steidten or Mark Noble. Now, indeed, there may be one or two academy players who are nearly ready to be in the senior squad. But at the same time, there could be a majority of those players who aren't ready. And for Steidten and Noble to suggest to the parents of these players that they're likely to, they're going to see more game time sometime soon, that doesn't quite ring true. Now, I know what people are going to say. If you don't give any of these academy players game time, how will you ever know if they're ready or not? Now, I hear that argument and I understand it. But the reality is, we don't know from the comfort of our armchairs just how things are really progressing and panning out in the academy. Yeah, we can watch the games on YouTube and we see the results, especially the under 21s, the results that they're getting against opposition teams and, of course, against lower league opposition in tournaments like the EFL Trophy. And of course, last season, we also saw the rise of the under 18s, winning the league, winning the FA Trophy, FA Cup Trophy. And now quite a lot of those under 18s have progressed to the under 21 squad, and they're part of the impressive setup that's happening at the moment. But aside from that, the only people that really know, excuse me, let's take that off. But aside from that, the only people that really know how they're really progressing are the coaches. Steve Potts coaching the under 21s and doing an exceptionally good job, and Kevin Keane coaching the under 18s and doing an even better job. Absolutely impressive sort of work that Kevin Keane has done with the under 18s over the past few years. And those coaches will be putting together reports, analysis, stats, etc. on these players. And I'm sure those are passed on to the likes of David Moyes and his senior coaching team. And they will look at that and look at the players playing as well when they get an opportunity and making decisions themselves whether they think that any of these academy players can deliver at senior level on a consistent basis. So maybe if Steidten and Noble did meet with the parents of the academy players, it perhaps went no further than to assure them that despite all the negative social media rumours being bandied around, West Ham United is a club that takes its academy seriously, and that the academy players who are good enough could potentially finally find their way into senior team football. But that would be as far as I guess the conversation is likely to have gone. As it stands, neither Steidten nor Noble have any authority or say as to who should get selected to be in the senior squad. Whether we like it or not, or whether we agree with the decisions that are currently being made about the academy players, that continues to be the manager's role. Now, the rumour is that once Moyes leaves the club, or if he leaves the club at the end of this season, then we will move to a head coach style setup where the technical director and the sporting director do have more of a say as to the development of the academy players. But if whoever becomes our head coach might be if he thinks that in the future that these academy players aren't good enough, then they won't get any more game time under a new head coach than they will do under David Moyes currently. But let's say, for argument's sake, that there is an element of truth in this rumour and that Steidten and Noble have met with the parents to promise more game time. What circumstances would force David Moyes' hand to promote academy players into the senior team setup and actually play them? Well, I guess logically, there are two that I can think of. The first relates to what happens in January. Put the January transfer window aside for a moment, but what I'm suggesting, what will happen in January, which will affect the senior team, is the African Cup of Nations. There's a potential that we would lose 4 players during that time: Mohamed Kudus, Said Benrahma, Naif Agurd, and Maxwell Cornet. Now, dependent on how their respective national teams get on in this tournament, we could lose some of these players for anything up to 5 weeks. Domestic clubs are usually required to release players that participate in the AFCON for at least a week prior to the tournament starting, which is on the 13th of January. And the tournament does not finish until 5 weeks later on February the 11th. Now, most players involved are also given a few days rest after their involvement before returning to club duty. So although that's got to be agreed between player and manager. This could have an impact on a number of games throughout January and February. We've got an FA Cup tie in early January to come. Then we're going to play Sheffield United as well as AFC Bournemouth. And then in February, we've away to Man United, at home to Arsenal, and away to Nottingham Forest. So the impact of having those 4 players missing could be 5 games, up as 6 games, including the FA Cup. Now, David Moyes has actually stated he is likely to have a conversation with Tim Steidten on how to keep the squad strong during this time, and whether that would mean having to dive into the transfer market to bring in reinforcements, or potentially it could mean that Moyes and Steidten agree that perhaps there are 1 or 2 academy players worth bringing into the senior squad who might be able to provide adequate cover during this period of time. Moyes has many times in the past suggested he doesn't like doing business in January and that it's difficult for him to get the players he wants and maybe not get the players for the, he doesn't want players just for the immediate future. He wants players for the long term. And it's highly unlikely that both he or Steidten are going to bring in stopgaps just to bolster the squad. So there may well be an opportunity where academy players could come into the fray and could really put down a marker to claim a place in the senior squad for the long term. Now, when it comes to activity in the transfer window, I doubt very much we'll be looking to replace all 4 of those players who might be away on international duty. However, when it comes to players like Cornet and Benrahma, we could be potentially looking at long-term replacements on the left side of attacking midfield. But I'm guessing that business is more likely to happen in the summer than it will do in January. Now, when it comes to Kudus and Agurd, perhaps digging into the academy could be the answer. Of course, aside from the players on international duty, the January window should give us the opportunity to be looking out for long-term replacements for other players too. Now, we have no fewer than 8 players in the senior squad with just 8 months remaining on their contracts, and 4 of them are well into their 30s. Unless anything changes between now and the end of this season, Ben Johnson, Pablo Fornals, Vladimir Soufal, Connor Coventry, Aaron Creswell, Lucas Fabianski, Angelo Ogbonna, and Joseph Anang could all be leaving West Ham United in the summer. And here is where the second opportunity may arise for academy players to break through into the senior squad. So we've got the 2 scenarios. We've got needing players to fill the void left by players going to the AFCON tournament in January, and also looking at players up to 8 players whose contracts are currently going to expire in the summer. However, every time we look to bolster the squad by buying a player in the transfer window, doesn't this further hinder an academy player's chances of getting into the senior squad? For example, there are many who suggest that we absolutely must buy a striker in January, with names like Serhou Guirassy being mentioned on more than one occasion. Let's say, for argument's sake, we do buy Guirassy from Stuttgart. Does this not further limit, for example, Divin Mbama's chances of making his mark in the first team? It certainly will for the rest of this season if we go and buy a striker in January. A season where for the past 12 months, we have tried to get Divin Mbama to sign a new contract in order not to lose him at the end of this season as well. Now, deals have been put in front of him and his agent, and they, from what we keep hearing, they've all been turned down on more than one occasion as well. So what would Mbama then decide to do if we went and bought a striker in January? It might force his hand. He might decide that, he simply cannot stay at West Ham. All right, granted, in the summer, we may get rid of other players like Danny Ings, but that would still leave Mbama having to potentially be our third choice striker. A new striker in either the January or the summer transfer window. Antonio still being there after he's had his contract extended. So he might still be Mbama third choice. So Steidten has got to get the balance right, both in the looming January transfer window as well as next summer's transfer window as well. Buy players in certain positions, and the academy players who are currently smashing it in those positions for the under-21s may feel that perhaps they do not have an immediate future pathway into the senior squad. And that's why, going back to, my thinking that this conversation that may have been had between Steidten, Noble and players' parents, I'm not so sure it really sort of panned out the way that's been suggested. So with the potential of needing 8 players to cover positions during AFCON and the further potential of up to 8 players possibly leaving West Ham next summer, which of our current crop of young talent could find themselves elevated to the senior squad? Well, we've got to start with Mbama, haven't we? Because he's already there. He's already part of the senior team, but regrettably not getting the game time that perhaps he or many fans would have liked. There was a massive cheer, probably the loudest of the night, when he came on as a late sub against Olympiacos at the London Stadium a few weeks back. And he immediately demonstrated why many fans want him to get more game time. For the 7 or 8 minutes that he was on the pitch, he was busy, scurrying around, closing down the Olympiacos defenders, running after balls, being a nuisance, and making it difficult for the Olympiacos players to compose themselves. And it was a good thing to see. We're not getting that from the likes of Danny Ings, are we? And that's why there's a frustration whenever Ings is chosen to come on as a sub instead of the young Mbama. His goal scoring record at academy level is second to none. He is a natural striker, and he will be one that I think could benefit from senior players being involved in the AFCON in January. There is, of course, another young striker in the under-21s who's also smashing it this season, and that's Callum Marshall, who's got something like 18 goals under his belt already this season. He's also a senior Northern Ireland international. I think he's now had 2 caps for Northern Ireland, and he's really making a big splash this season. He's another player that Moyes and his coaching staff might be looking at, who could also provide suitable alternative cover in the senior side. And he's also versatile because he's a left-footed player that plays out on the right, the roles that both Kudus and Bowen play in. And if Kudus is away for 5 weeks, then maybe, quite possibly, someone like Marshall could come in on the right side, or maybe play up front with Bowen playing out wide. Born in Glenmorley, Northern Ireland, this 18-year-old began his career at Bangor Rangers at the tender age of 7, when he then moved to Glentoran, and then in 2021, at the age of 16, he moved to Linfield. He only made a handful of starts for the Northern Ireland club in under a year, but was immediately snapped up by West Ham scouts in 2022. He made 39 appearances for the under 18s in his first season, scoring 29 goals. And it's no surprise that he, alongside a number of other under 18 players, has, as I've said earlier, progressed to the under 21s team this season at the age of 18. So far this season, in 21 appearances, he's scored 18 goals. Quite phenomenal record, which is set to surpass the tally scored by Mumbama when he was in the under 21 squad. There's an air of calm about the way Marshall plays. He's a very different style to Mumbama, but just as effective. Then, of course, we have one or two players out on loan that could stake a claim in the senior squad next season. Freddie Potts, for example, who's out on loan at League One side Wycombe Wanderers. He made a massive impression at the club so far, and there is a sense that this 20-year-old defensive midfielder could indeed be the real thing. He made something like 50 appearances for the under-21s before the club decided to give him some real game time by sending him out on loan this season. Potts has signed an extended contract at West Ham, currently till 2026. And there's a good chance, as I've said, that he could come back from his loan spell and become something like an understudy to Edson Alvarez next season. Now, unless we extend his contract yet again, I'm expecting Lucas Fabianski to be one of the players that will leave the club in the summer. So I'm guessing it's kind of nailed on that this summer we're gonna have to invest in another goalkeeper, and at least as a challenger to Alphonse Areola, if not as someone who will stake a claim in the first team. With the likes of goalkeepers like Aaron Ramsdale potentially looking to move on from Arsenal, would the signing of another keeper have an impact on any of our young keepers progressing to the senior squad? We've got a number of goalies out on loan. Nathan Trott, for example, he's spending his second season at Danish club Vejle BK. And Christian Heggie has gone out on loan at Stevenage. But it is Trott who's been gaining the experience of playing regularly, whilst Heggie is only playing sparingly at Stevenage. I think Heggie has only made something like 6 appearances so far this season. Now, in 2022, Nathan Trott signed a 2-year extension to his contract, which at present also ends in the summer of 2024, which is the same time as that of current third choice keeper Joseph Anangs. Now, whilst Trott has spent a number of seasons out on loan, Anang's loan spell last season came to an abrupt end when he broke his hand whilst on loan at Derby. Obviously, Anang has recovered now, and he is, as I said, our third choice keeper. But will he be when Trott comes back from his loan spell from Vejle? Of the 3 keepers, Heggie is the youngest at 21 and also has a contract till 2025. So it's going to be interesting to see what the club does with our goalies next season. But I can see one of these 3 being kept on as third choice, filling yet another void in the squad in summer. For Trott and Anang, they're of similar age. Anang being 23, Trott 24. And although keepers tend to flourish later in their years, both keepers will probably be keen to take the next step in their careers by either pushing at least to be the number 2 at a club like West Ham, or settling for number 3, or moving on to pastures new, either to be challenging as a first choice keeper or a number 2 at a club in a league lower, maybe Championship or League One level. So there they are. There are 4 potential academy players who could quite well find themselves elevated to senior squad next season because of the number of players that may be out of contract and leaving in the summer. There are 1 or 2 other notable ones as well. Midfielder George Earthy, 19-year-old central midfielder, who's another player who stepped up from the under-18s into the under-21 squad this season. Classy attacking midfielder who's actually a delight to watch. Then, of course, there's left-back Ollie Scarles, who we were introduced to last season when Moyes played him in a European game. And finally, defenders Levi Lang and the Brazilian, Luzao. Do you remember him when we signed him last January? And Michael Forbes, Plus, finally, the under-21 captains and the very understated but very impressive midfielder, Gideon Kodua. So, yes, we do have a fine crop of players that we could be looking at bringing in and breaking through for maybe next season. But for the immediate future, I think all eyes are on Mbama, Marshall, Potts, and one of our young keepers. What happens in the next two transfer windows will certainly help shape the future of many of our academy players, and hopefully for the better.